I'm August Cole, Director of the Art of Future Warfare Project at the Atlantic Council's Brent Scowcroft Center on International Security. We're joined today by Shawn Coyne, editor, agent, and writer, whose long career in publishing has seen him working with many of the industry's top talents. He's the co-owner of Black Irish Books, along with Stephen Pressfield, and is the author of The Story Grid, What Good Editors Know, and which he'll talk a bit about today with us. So the story grid is as much a system as it is an attitude, a commitment to the idea that stories have certain essential elements that, if they're found missing, will come up short. And there's process in this book, but also I think a really clear articulation about why writing and the creative process itself needs to be taken seriously. That comes through this disciplined approach Shawn talks about. It's as good as an approach to understanding, I think, any one idea makes it only as strong as the structure upon which it rests, however. And in this case, this is something I think Shawn can speak to, in large part because of his experience editing people whose work has lacked some of this structure. Shawn, thank you for joining us today, and it's great to have you talking with the Art of Future Warfare Project.
Oh, thank you, August. I'm happy to be here.
So there are a lot of writing books out there. You go to any bookstore or on Amazon, you can see this. This one, though, stands apart because I find it both useful and credible. So talk first a bit about why did you decide to put this down on paper?
Well, I started in book publishing over 20 years ago, around 1991. And one of the things that I discovered was that nobody really wanted to share their expertise. And I didn't want to believe that people just didn't know what they were doing. So what I did is I started to explore storytelling and editing and the craft myself. And I read everything from George Pulte to Robert McKee to Aristotle to find out what are the core central foundational elements of storytelling that I could use as an editor and, progress in my own profession and help writers tell better stories. So the reason why I wrote this book is there really isn't anything out there. There is no editing 101 book that I could find back in 1991, nor could you find it a year ago, that explained exactly what an editor does. What an editor does when a manuscript comes to them. How do they evaluate it? How do they help the writer get into the book and fix all the problems, and also make all the really terrific things in it even better? So the story grid is my methodology that I've developed over a 25-year career working with best-selling writers and writers in nonfiction and in fiction to tell better stories, to tell stories that actually move people to change their behavior, to change their points of view, to really, every story that we tell is a process of teaching somebody how to change through through the storytelling craft itself. So the reason why I wrote the book is that the first thing is I didn't want to let all the knowledge that I've poured into my brain over so many years go to waste. And I have kids now, and I thought to myself, geez, wouldn't it be great to be able to share all the things that I've learned in a way that other people can benefit from them as quickly as possible and as cheaply as possible, and they can go as deep into the storytelling craft as they wish.
You've likened the approach to a CT scan. One of the technologies that lets us see deepest into our bodies. I think a lot of writers would probably fear that in terms of a deep dive into their book for its insight into their soul. But talk a bit about that kind of ability to go into a story and see it for the most important elements, and talk a little bit too about why you capitalize the word story itself, because that I think is a really interesting facet of the way you approach this, because it signals how important that in fact is to the experience of both the writer but also the editor.
Well, the reason why I used CT scan was if you look at a story in terms of its in terms of its health, it's a living, breathing thing, and all the best stories are immortal. We still read Charles Dickens, we still read Herodotus, we still read Homer. And it's really the only way you can become immortal is to write a wonderful, perfectly tuned story that can travel through time.
That's great.
And so the reason why I say CT scan is you want to diagnose what the problems. If you're not feeling well, you want a diagnosis. So that's what the story grid does. And you shouldn't fear it. It's just going to tell you where, where that joint pain is coming from and how to fix it. So anybody who's afraid of going to the doctor is probably not going to get a lot out of the story grid.
So what are some of the most common things that you've found in working with writers? The problems that seem to crop up the most, because a lot of the people who'll be watching this will be either transitioning to fiction for the first time, will be very accomplished, policy writers, academics, and I think that interplay between the stories that we make up and the world that we're in is getting, thankfully, very blurred, and coming up with some great narratives accordingly. So I'd love to hear again about the problems that crop up the most, and maybe people can help kind of avoid those.
Well, I think the biggest problem an amateur writer would face is creating a map, knowing exactly what the purpose of their story is. And we all feel as if we have a story to tell. And this is why self-publishing is such a large, marketplace right now, because everybody believes that they inherently have the ability to tell a great story. And these are the reason why people go to bars. They want to hang out with people who are great storytellers. And we do. Everybody does have that inherent DNA that tells them exactly when a story works and when it doesn't work. And the trick is that taking that inherent ability of a human being and making it a process, a methodology that you can use to actually tell a great story is difficult. So the question you asked is, what is the biggest problem most writers have? And I would say it's they don't know what kind of story they're telling and why they are telling it. And if I were to give one piece of advice about how to fix that, is to understand the global genres of storytelling. If you know that you want to tell a terrific story, a mystery crime story, really immerse yourself in your favorite mystery and crime stories, and you can tell what they are because they're categorized in a bookstore or on Amazon.com or BarnesandNoble.com, and find those ones that move you the most, and then pick them apart and find out what they all have in common. Because what they have in common are the conventions and obligatory scenes of a particular kind of a story. Now, a lot of people say, well, that's nice for fiction, but that's not going to help me in nonfiction. And that's really not true either. Because nonfiction has some very, very important genres too. And to know exactly what the purpose of your story is and why people will need it to change is the first battle you really need to face as an amateur writer. And it's going to be intimidating, but it's also going to be exciting because you'll have some very practical questions to ask yourself and to answer.
So as writers go about doing this, which is really wonderful homework of reading, should you stick with a book that is not connecting with you, for research purposes, or should you drop it?
No, I mean, the only reason to really do that is to discover why it's not working, to find out, the problems that the writer, the traps they fell into, and to avoid doing them. But I think we always learn better. And a lot of people are always asking me, oh yeah, I read that, what about that terrible bestseller that's out there right now? He didn't pay off that second act the way he was supposed to. And, after I read the story grid, you could really rip that thing apart. Why don't you rip that thing apart? And my response to that is that we always learn from masterpieces far better than we learn from flawed works. So I try and when I write it on the story grid, I have a website, storygrid.com, and everything I write on that is about masterful writers writing at their best. And the reason why I do that, and I don't rip apart and criticize as much as I do praise, is because I think to see a master at work is far more instructive than seeing an amateur fiddle and futz around and make mistakes. I consider myself a really terrible carpenter, but when I want to learn something, I'll look at a really nice piece of furniture and I'll say to myself, oh, that's the way that master craftsman put together that tendon and that joint, so that I can learn from that instead of seeing some scraggled, lousy bench that I made. Nobody's going to learn anything from that. And I feel the same way in terms of story. If you can learn from the masters, you're going to learn a lot more than from amateurs.
So how do you convince a writer that the connection between creativity and formal process is there, that they're not going to be hindered, by something that it makes them work in a different way than may feel instinctive as somebody starting out?
Well, here's the thing. Anybody who complains and says, "Oh, that doesn't work for me," I know they're a faker. I know they're not really a professional. Because every professional writer I've ever worked with, they are so secure in the amount of work that they put in to learn their craft that they are not intimidated by anybody saying, "Hey, let's take a look at the structure here. Let's take a look. Let me evaluate your story and go scene by scene with you and see where we can improve it." They're over the moon excited about that process. They don't want to talk about, how the muses descend upon them when they're writing and how I'm going to block the muses from coming to them, because they understand creativity is a mystical experience, but it's also extremely practical. You have to be a blue-collar laborer every single day, sitting in your chair, busting your butt for creativity and magical moments to come to you. They just don't, people don't sit down and write the great American novel in 12 hours or 30 hours. It takes 12 years to write something really remarkable, or 12 years of hard work.
Right. No, I think that's one of the underappreciated aspects of writing, that you have to sit down and just do it and not
you have to read
about. You have to read a lot and make time for both of those, even when it's not something that you physically or mentally want to do, because you don't know, you might actually have that moment of clarity or creativity. There's a lot of writing right now in the national security community, particularly within the military. There's a generation of young and mid-grade officers who are doing, I would say, probably more writing than ever, and getting some pretty good official top cover from it. From generals like Lieutenant General McMaster in the Army, or retired Admiral James Stavridis, who's now at Fletcher. So there's an appreciation that writing matters, that it's important to your professional military duty now to express yourself that way. So what would you offer as takeaways from the story grid for that community, who I think are going to be doing some really impactful work already, who are doing impactful work already, but I think in the next few years it's going to be really exciting to see how the hours they're putting in writing and editing each other's work today pays off?
Well, I'll tell you a story about this, because this is the military and military issues are very, very near and dear to my heart, and my business partner, Stephen Pressfield, too. Now, I'm going to preface this by saying everything that I say is my own personal opinion, and I'm not speaking for any of the people that I work with. Stephen Pressfield. This is not controversial. Don't get crazy. So the importance of storytelling for the military community, I can't stress it more. A few years ago, Stephen Pressfield, my business partner, introduced me to a guy named Jim Gant. Now, Jim Gant was a Special Forces officer, and he had been in Afghanistan, and he sort of embedded himself with a tribe, a Pashtun tribe there, and he wrote about it, and he wrote about it very passionately and very clearly, and it was a paper called One Tribe at a Time. Now, this was a paper that basically said, we need to revise our military strategy in Afghanistan. We are not engaging the Pashtun tribes in the way that we possibly, that could help them move forward and take control of their own country. Whether you agree with him or not is not really the point of this story. So Jim wrote this paper. He knew Steve Pressfield through Steve's wonderful book, Gates of Fire, which is required reading in Special Forces circles and in the military in general, which is about the Spartans. So on a flyer, he sent the paper to Steve, and Steve fell in love with the book, with the paper, and Steve published it on his website, stephenpressfield.com. And because Steve is well known in the military community, guess what? A lot of major military figures at the time read that paper because Steve put it on his site. And soon thereafter, Jim was pulled out of his command and tasked with going and instituting this new kind of theory that he had over in Afghanistan. And it changed the entire military's policies and strategies, global strategies and tactics, through Jim's passionate use of his brain and his writing ability, explaining exactly why he believed the things that he believed. And it's a wonderful story that's actually, there's a book called American Spartan, which is about Jim, and I'll leave it at that. But the reason why I say this story is that here we had one special forces officer, a Green Beret, who had on-the-ground experience, who had some thoughts about how he could improve the greatest military in the modern world. And because he was such a gifted storyteller and passionate and not trained, he just wrote what he felt and what he believed passionately. He changed the military policy within a period of 3 to 4 years and shifted a lot of what we believed was important in the military circles. So for young officers and for people in the military community to ignore storytelling as a tool to change the military, ethos and strategies and tactics, it's silly. They should really, really concentrate on storytelling. So what does all this have to do with the story grid? The story grid is all about teaching people how to tell effective stories to change people's minds. When you finish a great novel, or you finish, anybody who reads the Iliad or anybody who reads the Odyssey, when they finish reading that book, it changes them at the deepest heart of themselves. And if you can bring that skill set to what you think is so important within the military, you are going to change the higher ups. You just will. If you're an effective storyteller, they're going to say, hey, let's bring this guy in. I want to hear what he has to say. And you know what? A lot of military policy is affected by think tanks in Washington. And how do those guys communicate? Through storytelling, through papers. This is what happened at this time in history. This is what's happening now. Let's make some decisions based upon this information that we know. So storytelling is an integral part of military strategy and policy.
One of the things we've been doing at the Art of Future Warfare project is using short stories to look forward, and in a sense, tracking the arc of modern and future conflict, from how wars start to what happens to the people who fight them and experience them afterwards. And one of the things we found is that as we moved along that arc and built some community around that, there was a tremendous outpouring of interest in sharing these kinds of fictional, 3,000 to 5,000 word vignettes.
Yeah.
So the short story is a very approachable way to do this. What advice would you have for short story writers who are, trying to use narrative to look ahead in a useful way, to do something akin to what Jim Ghent did by pointing out the problems of tomorrow so we don't run into them, in the near term?
This is a great question. The great thing about storytelling is that it's a series of Russian dolls. And what I mean by that is that they each build upon themselves. A novel is a series of Russian dolls that are pulled together in one big package. So if you're a short story writer, the same principles that go into writing a great scene, you can extrapolate into writing a great short story. Now, a short story is probably between 4 to 5 really tight scenes. Now, a scene has a beginning, middle, and end. So does a short story. So figure out what your beginning, your middle, and your end is of your short story, and then break it down into scenes. How many scenes will it take? It's like Name That Tune. How few scenes can I use to tell my story in a most effective way? Now, the most important thing, and this is my own personal opinion, one of the big problems that I think we have, not only in the military, but in any major industry or corporation, is a lack of vision. What's the controlling idea? What is our goal? What do we want at the end? What do we want our climax of our story to be? We want to leave Iraq in a democracy. We want to leave it self-contained and strong and vital in and of itself. And we want to pull our guys out. That would be probably our end game in particular, areas of conflict. How do we get there? Let's figure out a story. We start here, we move here, and we end here. And you change your story based upon things that come at you that you don't see coming. So when you're writing a short story about a vision of the future and a military strategy or a tactic, think about the ending payoff. What do you believe is the most important thing that people who read this story are going to take away? Should we pull out all of our troops now? Is that I'm just making things up, but what is your controlling idea? What is your vision? You just can't write about conflict and how everything is terrible and there's no solutions and what we need to do is crawl under a rock. Be a visionary. Think about if you are God when you write a story. This is the beauty of storytelling. You are the master of the universe. So be a master.
There's a lot in that reminds me of the conversations right now about designing strategy that's both dynamic but also, you know, faithful to the future that you want to go to. And to be honest, looking far in the future or even in the near term is one of the biggest challenges in a lot of organizations, because whether it's the tyranny of the inbox or just the constraints we impose upon ourselves. You know, characters seem to be a good way, in focusing on characters, to break out of that, because you can often build an idea around a memorable person and express it through them. I mean, do you find that there could be room for that in the official, you know, canon, you know, memos and white papers that shift to something more akin to, you know, narrative and short stories?
Absolutely. I think one of the great methods of changing behavior is to use historical figures. And I'll bring up, you know, one of probably it is the top novel I've ever worked on, which is Gates of Fire by Stephen Pressfield. Now, Stephen Pressfield did not travel back in time to figure out how the Spartans lived. But what he did do is he immersed himself in the world of Sparta. And he found some of the lead figures, Leonidas and all these. And then he projected what he believed those people were all about, what their ethos was. And so when he tells the story of Gates of Fire, it feels absolutely real. It's historical fiction. So if you were writing a paper to change some tactic or strategy, I would suggest, why don't you go back and look at the historical record? Was there a time when Washington faced this kind of dilemma? I bet there was. Was there a time when Cornwallis or you know, any of the master generals of antiquity, or World War II or World War I? Go find that, and then use that episode to be the inspiration for a fictional story in the future. Or you could even set it in the previous past. The great thing about historical fiction is that the only reason to write historical fiction is to comment on contemporary times.
Right.
So the reason why Gates of Fire struck such a strong chord in the military this very day is because it's about brotherhood. It's about fighting for your guys, the guy next to you. And this is why guys in the military attach to it so strongly, because that is the core focus and the ethos of being a warrior. It's separating yourself from yourself and doing it for the guy next to you. Now, if you can take that ethos and extend it to a larger group, then you could tell some great stories that way. And there's nothing more effective than combining historical fact with fiction. And it's a very convincing argument.
When you talk about a broad audience, certainly that is something that fiction and the like do well. One of the challenges in the policymaking community is you may be trying to impact, the decider, whether it's the president or a service chief or an agency director. How should an editor, because there is a lot of writing by committee in these kinds of circles, or even a writer themselves, think about writing for a single person versus writing for a broader audience where you're influencing, perhaps thousands.
It's a great question. It's a great question. And my suggestion is always this: empathy. Always think about empathy. Think about who that person is. And I say this even when you're writing for a global mass audience. Think about your ideal reader. What do they want from the experience? What challenges are they going through? How terrible, how difficult a job is Secretary of Defense, right? Think about that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And what would convince somebody who's in that position, what are the challenges that they're facing day to day, and then directly, address those challenges in the work, so that they can say, wow, this guy knows the situation I'm facing. I've got this budget, I've got these demands, I've got political concerns, I've got 1,000 different things I've got to deal with. How can I put my vision, how can I put vision first? How can I change things that, that people are going to say, you know what, I'm behind you. How can you figure that out? Think about that individual audience. If it's, if you're trying to get funding from some place, think about who turns the channel on that funding. What are they going through? It's empathy.
And when people are setting out, in their careers early on as writers, and as a reporter, it might be you look around the newsroom, for example, and you see someone who's far more experienced and say, I want to be like that person, in 15 years. Who are the writers you've worked with, whether it's Elmore Leonard or Stephen Pressfield, who have qualities you think that people should aspire to, and what might those be as folks sort of shoot for the stars?
Well, I'll tell you, some of the finest writers I've ever worked with are blue collar kind of guys. And these are the guys who publish a book every year in, year out. They finish one book and they start a new one. I'm talking about people like Robert Crace and James Lee Burke and Michael Connelly and Stephen King, who does 2 or 3. I never got to work with Stephen King. I'll say that right now, but fantastic writer. These guys, they put their head down. It's their job. They're not waiting for the gods to descend to give them the great American novel. They're busting their butt on every single individual title, every book. They're trying to get better. They're thinking 3 books ahead all the time. So these are the people that, I mentioned earlier. They are not afraid of criticism. They love intelligent, thoughtful analysis of their work. I've been working with Stephen Pressfield since Gates of Fire, over 20 years, about 20 years. And never have I been in a position where Steve has said to me, yeah, that's not the way I work. Even when he disagrees with me, what he'll say to me, he's so smart. He'll say, hey, give me a couple days to marinate on this. And the letters that I send him are, they're pretty intense. They're 30 pages long saying, this scene doesn't work. This scene doesn't work. You got to up the ante here. You've got to change this. You've got to think about your ending payoff. You didn't deliver what you were promising here. I don't get into, you're the greatest thing ever, Steve, and I think you're one of the finest writers I've ever worked with. He doesn't get that. He doesn't want that. He doesn't want that at all. Yeah, I tell him all the time, but what he wants is analysis and constructive criticism that can make him better. And does it piss him off when he reads it? He says, he doesn't get what I was trying to do here. This guy's an idiot. What kind of editor? He's not very intelligent if he didn't get the point I was trying to make. So it's all about those writers who are constantly It's like Michael Jordan taking foul shots for hour after hour after hour. Nobody's saying to Michael Jordan, hey, get in that gym and do the work. He's doing it because that's his thing. That's his passion. Just like you have a passion and you're trying to do your thing, this is their passion too. And you can combine and if you can combine a writing skill and a storytelling skill with any other kind of world, that's a recipe for success and personal, validation.
Well, Shawn, thanks for joining us today and for giving us your time and a lot of inspirational guidance.
Oh, not at all. My pleasure.
With the Art of Future Warfare project, I'm August Cole, and we've been joined by Shawn Coyne, the author of StoryGrid, What Good Editors Know, and you can read more at storygrid.com. Shawn, once again, thank you, and we'll hope to catch up again soon.
Oh, absolutely. Thanks, August.
Thanks.